Hey guys, tonight we're stepping away from the familiar glow of our screens and into the chilling mists of the past. Imagine you are standing on a small island in a cold, freshwater lake. The wind is relentless, cutting through your modern jacket, and it carries the scent of pine and damp earth. All around you are the quiet, grassy mounds of an ancient burial field, secrets sleeping just beneath your feet for over 1,000 years. It's a place where legends were born, and where, sometimes, they are reborn as truth. This isn't a theme park or a movie set. This is the real thing, a world of iron, wood, and bone. And if you were truly here, back then, dressed in scratchy wool, and subsisting on dried fish and hard bread, let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive the winter. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's a quiet, no-pressure way to support the channel. And while you're at it, I'd love to see where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see our little community spread across the globe. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air is thin and sharp in your lungs. You're on the Swedish island of Björk, which translates simply enough to Birch Island. It feels remote now, a quiet place for a day trip from Stockholm. But a millennium ago, this was a bustling epicenter of commerce and culture. This was the town of Birka, one of the most important trading hubs of the Viking Age. You walk through the vast field of graves, over 2,000 of them, small humps in the earth that are the final resting places of traders, artisans, slaves, and warriors who lived and died in a world vastly different from your own. Your destination is a specific plot of land, a terrace high up, overlooking the dark water where longships once sliced through the waves. Here, a grave designated BJ 581 was excavated long ago, back in the late 1870s. For over a century, its story was thought to be simple, straightforward. A great warrior, a powerful chieftain, buried with all the trappings of his violent and prestigious life. But we're here tonight because that simple story, the one everyone accepted for decades, was wrong. And in its unraveling, a myth came roaring back to life. Let's first talk about that myth. The Shield Maiden, the Skjaldner. The image is instantly recognizable, cemented in our minds by a century of art, literature, and now, popular television shows. She is a woman who chooses the sword over the spindle, the shield over the loom. She is fierce, autonomous, and fights alongside men, her skill and bravery earning her their respect and fear. The Norse sagas, the epic poems written down centuries after the Viking Age, are filled with their stories. There's Lagertha, the legendary ruler from the Gesta Dawnrön, who fought with such ferocity that the great Ragnar Lothbrok himself fell for her. There's Hervor from the Hervorar saga, who retrieves a cursed sword from her father's burial mound, defying his ghost to claim her birthright as a warrior. And of course, there is the most famous of all, Brynhildr, the Valkyrie shield maiden from the Volsunga saga, so formidable that only the hero Sigurd could defeat her, tricked into a battle of wits and strength. For a long time, historians treated these figures with a heavy dose of skepticism. They were seen as literary creations, poetic fantasies designed to explore themes of fate, honor, and the subversion of norms. The argument was sound, based on the evidence available. Archaeology consistently showed a clear division of labor. In Viking society, men were buried with weapons, swords, axes, spears. Women were buried with the tools of the domestic sphere, weaving implements, cooking pots, jewelry, keys signifying their role as managers of the household. This was the pattern, repeated in grave after grave across Scandinavia. The sagas were exciting stories, the scholars said, but they weren't history. They were the medieval equivalent of a superhero movie, a romanticized vision of the past where anything was possible. A female warrior leading men into battle? It was deemed as likely as Thor riding his goat-drawn chariot across the sky. It was a wonderful, powerful, but ultimately a fake legend. Now, let your mind drift back to that windswept hill in Burka. Let's go back to the 1870s, when an archaeologist named Jolmer Stolp first put his shovel in the ground at Grave BJ 581. The work then wasn't the painstaking, grid-based, dental pick and brush affair it is today. It was a bit more enthusiastic, a treasure hunt in some ways. But what Stolp and his team found was spectacular. This was no ordinary grave. This was the final resting place of someone incredibly important. Imagine the scene as the dirt is slowly cleared away. First, the outline of a large, rectangular wooden chamber becomes visible. This person was not simply put in the ground. They were interred in a room, a subterranean hall for the dead. As they dig deeper, the glint of metal appears. A sword. Its iron blade corroded, but its form unmistakable. A weapon of high status. Near it, an axe. Not a simple wood-chopping axe, but a warrior's bearded axe designed for brutal effect. Two shields, their wooden bodies long since rotted away, but their iron bosses, the metal domes at the center, remain, silent and potent. Then, more weapons emerge. A cluster of spearheads. A sheath of arrows, fletched to fly true and tipped, with armor-piercing iron. A seax, the classic Viking long knife, perfect for close-quarters fighting. And a smaller knife for the more mundane tasks of life and death. This arsenal alone would mark the grave as that of a dedicated warrior. But there was more. At the feet of the deceased, the team uncovered the skeletons of two horses, a mara and a stallion. These were not just work animals. They were status symbols, a sign of immense wealth and power, sacrificed to serve their master in the afterlife. In the lap of the skeleton, they found something else. A collection of game pieces, carved from bone or antler. It was a full set for a game called Nifatov, which translates to King's Table. This wasn't a game of chance like dice. It was a game of pure strategy, a Viking-era version of chess. This quirky little detail is crucial. The person buried here was not just a fighter. They were a tactician, a commander, someone who understood strategy and leadership. The grave screamed military leader, a high-ranking Viking commander laid to rest with their weapons, their horses, and their war games, ready to ride into Valhalla. And so, for more than 100 years, that's who everyone thought was in grave BJ 581, the Burka warrior. He became the archetypal Viking chieftain, a textbook example of a powerful man's burial. His grave goods were drawn in encyclopedias, displayed in museums, and discussed in academic papers, all under the assumption that the skeleton within was male. No one questioned it. The sheer volume of high-status weaponry made the conclusion seem obvious. It was a perfect fit for the established narrative. But science, unlike stories, is always evolving. New tools allow us to ask new questions of old things. And in the 2010s, a team of researchers from Stockholm and Uppsala universities decided to take a closer look at the Burka warrior. They weren't looking to append a century of scholarship. They were simply doing due diligence, re-examining old finds with new technology. An osteologist, a specialist in the study of bones, first looked at the skeleton. Without knowing the context of the grave goods, just looking at the bones themselves, she noted that the skeleton's features, the gracile jaw, the width of the pelvis, were more consistent with a female than a male. This was unexpected. A ripple of confusion. Could it be? It was possible, but bone analysis can sometimes be ambiguous. Maybe the skeleton was just a very slender man. Maybe there were two bodies in the grave originally. and the male one had decomposed completely. The scholars were cautious. The weight of tradition, of 100 years of assumption, is a powerful thing. The idea was intriguing, but it was far from proven. The cultural image of the Viking man, bearded and brandishing an axe, is a hard one to shift. It would take more than a maybe. It would take something definitive. And so they turned to the most definitive tool they had, DNA analysis. They drilled a tiny amount of bone powder from a tooth and a limb bone places where the genetic material would be best preserved. The process is delicate, fraught with the risk of contamination from modern DNA. You can imagine the tension in the lab, the careful, sterile environment, a stark contrast to the muddy 19th century dig. They were extracting a message that had been sealed away for 1,000 years. And when the results came back, the message was clear and unambiguous. The skeleton contained 2 X chromosomes, no Y chromosome. The great warrior, the high-status military commander, the textbook example of a Viking chieftain buried in grave. BJ 581 was a woman. The news landed like a thunderclap in the world of Viking studies. It was published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology in 2017, and the reaction was immediate and intense. Some celebrated it as concrete proof that the shield maidens of legend were real. Others reacted with fierce skepticism, trying to find any other explanation. The debate was, and in some corners still is, incredibly heated. This is where we encounter one of those fascinating points of academic contention. Historians still argue whether the presence of weapons in a grave definitively proves the occupant was a warrior in life. The skeptical argument goes like this. Perhaps the weapons were symbolic. Perhaps she inherited them. Perhaps she was buried in a male relative's grave. Perhaps the weapons were a symbol of her family's status, not her own profession. It's the idea that objects are just objects, and we shouldn't read too much into them. But the researchers who made the discovery pushed back hard. They pointed out that no one had ever suggested the weapons were symbolic when the skeleton was presumed to be male. The assumption was immediate. Male skeleton plus weapons equals male warrior. To change the rules now, to insist the weapons suddenly, becomes symbolic simply because the bones are female, seemed like a clear double standard, a modern bias projected onto the past. And when you look at the evidence in its totality, the symbolic argument starts to look a little thin. This wasn't just one sword. It was a complete arsenal for a mounted archer commander. And it included the Nefertov set, the game of strategy. When you put it all together, the strategic location of the grave overlooking the garrison, the 2 horses, the full suite of weapons, and the strategy game, the most straightforward interpretation is that this woman held a position of military authority. She wasn't just a warrior. She was a commander. Let's take a moment and try to visualize her. Let's leave the lab and the academic journals behind and travel back to the 10th century. Stand on that same terrace, but now the air is thick with wood smoke from 100 longhouses. The grassy mounds are gone, replaced by the bustling, crowded, and probably very smelly reality of Burka. It's a riot of sound and language. You hear the Old Norse of the locals mingling with the Slavic and Arabic of traders, the Finno-Ugric of trappers from the north. The harbor below is a forest of masts. Ships have arrived from the Volga, from Hidibi, from Ireland, even from the Byzantine Empire. They bring silver dirhams, silk, glass beads, and wine. They leave with furs, amber, slaves, and walrus ivory. This is a mainstream historical fact that's easy to forget. The Vikings weren't just raiders. They were master traders and explorers, creating a vast network that connected continents. Urka was a key node in that network, a vibrant, violent, and cosmopolitan place. And overlooking it all, perhaps standing near the town's fortress, is the woman from our grave. She is tall for her time, likely over 5.5 feet. She is well past 30, a survivor at an age when many did not see their 30th birthday. What does she look like? We can't know for sure, but we can guess. Her hair, perhaps blonde, or red, is likely braided neatly. Her face is weathered by the sun and the wind. She is not dressed in silks or fine jewelry, but in practical, well-made wool and leather. At her hip hangs the sword. Its hilt may be decorated with silver wire. On her back is a quiver of arrows. She is not a fantasy figure in impractical armor. She is a professional. She is scanning the horizon, watching the ships, assessing threats. The men of the garrison look to her not with surprise, but with respect. She is their leader. She has earned her position through skill, through strategic thinking, and very likely, through bloodshed. Her existence forces us to rethink everything we thought we knew about this society. It suggests that while the domestic sphere was certainly the primary role for most Viking Age women, it was not the only one. It suggests that in this dynamic, often brutal, and surprisingly meritocratic world, a woman could, if she had the skill and the will, rise to a position of ultimate authority, even on the battlefield. The sagas, once dismissed as mere fantasy, now look different. They no longer seem like complete fabrications. Instead, they feel like echoes of a more complex reality, stories that remembered and perhaps exaggerated the lives of real women who broke the mold. The legend of the Shield Maiden, it turns out, wasn't fake. It was just waiting, patiently, in the cold Swedish soil. For us to find it thinking about her life, you have to wonder about the day-to-day realities. Forget the grand battles for a moment. What was it like just to exist? Hygiene, for instance, is a topic we tend to romanticize. Away. The Vikings were actually known to be quite fastidious for their time, at least according to some accounts. Archaeologists have found tweezers, ear spoons, and combs in abundance. An English chronicler, John of Wallingford, complained that the Viking men were too popular with English women because they combed their hair daily, bathed every Saturday, and changed their clothes frequently. So, our commander was likely cleaner than the stereotypical mud-caked warrior. Still, life was pungent. The smell of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, livestock, tanning leather, and fish would have been a constant, inescapable companion. It's the kind of sensory detail you don't get from looking at a sword in a museum case. It makes you realize that their world, for all its epic deeds, was also grounded in a very real, very odorous earth. A bit of a joke to think of it, really. This legendary warrior leading a charge, all while smelling faintly of pine tar, sweat, and last night's herring. And what of her power? How did she command these men? Was it through lineage? Charisma? Sheer terror? The Nefertov board suggests a keen intellect. This was not a mindless berserker. This was a chess master, a planner. In a raid or a defense, you wouldn't just follow someone because they were strong. You would follow them because they won. You would follow them because their plans worked, because they kept you alive and brought you wealth. Her authority was likely born from competence. She could probably read the winds and the tides, track an enemy through the forest, and devise a battle plan that turned an enemy's strength into a weakness. In the brutal calculus of Viking Age life, results were all that mattered. Her gender might have been unusual, but her success would have been undeniable. Her death must have been a momentous event. The construction of her grave chamber, the sacrifice of 2 prize horses, the interment of a fortune in weaponry, this was a major public ceremony. It was a statement. It was a community honoring one of its most powerful protectors. Imagine the scene. Her body, washed and dressed in her finest clothes, is carried up the hill. The air is filled with the sound of chanted poems, laments for the fallen leader. The horses are led to the graveside. their breath misting in the cold air, before they are killed to join their mistress. Her weapons are laid carefully beside her, placed for easy access in the next world. The gaming pieces are set in her lap, ready for a match with the gods. As the wooden roof of the chamber is lowered and the earth is piled on top, a story is being set in stone and soil. A story of power, respect, and a life lived against the grain. A story that was then forgotten, its true meaning obscured by our own assumptions for 1,000 years. The discovery of the Birka Shield Maiden doesn't mean that there were armies of female Viking warriors. That's almost certainly not the case. The traditional gender roles were still the norm. But it proves that exceptions were not just possible, but that they could reach the highest echelons of society. It opens a crack in the monolith of the patriarchal past, allowing for a more nuanced and complicated picture to emerge. She wasn't just a woman with weapons. She was a warrior who was a woman, and her existence makes the world of the Vikings feel that much richer, that much more surprising, and that much more human. It reminds us that history is not a static, settled thing. It is a living conversation, constantly revised by new discoveries that force us to look back and see the past not as we imagined it, but as it might have truly been. As you stand on that hill today, the wind rustling the birch leaves, you can almost feel the weight of that story. The quiet mound becomes something more. It's a monument to a woman who defied the expectations of her time and ours. A commander who played a game of strategy in life and took the board with her into death. The legend was that women could be warriors. The reality, sealed in this grave, is that at least one of them was, and she was not just a warrior, but a chief. It's a powerful thought to drift off on. The idea that the stories we dismiss as fantasy might just be truths we haven't found the evidence for yet. That buried beneath our feet, all over the world, are the remains of people who lived lives far grander and stranger than we can possibly imagine. The Shield Maiden of Birka was a myth we thought was fake. Now, she is history. And as you settle in, letting the story fade into the background of your mind, you can perhaps picture her, not in a bloody battle, but in a quiet moment at the end of a long day, sitting by the fire in a smoky longhouse, moving a carved piece across a game board, planning her next move. A silent tactician, her story finally told. The silence here on Birch Island is profound. The sounds of the modern world, the hum of traffic, the distant sirens are all gone. There is only the wind, the cry of a lone gull, and the gentle lapping of the lake water against the shore. It is a silence that holds 1,000 years of history. In that quiet, you can better appreciate the magnitude of what lies beneath the grass. It's not just a collection of artifacts. It's the final chapter of a human life, a life that was lived with a purpose and a power that we are only just beginning to understand. It's a sobering reminder that our understanding of the past is a constantly shifting landscape, and a single, carefully analyzed piece of bone can reshape it entirely. We love to put people from the past into neat little boxes. The men were like this, the women were like that. It simplifies things, makes history easier to digest. But people are never that simple. The Birka commander is proof of that. She doesn't fit in the box. She breaks it. It's almost a little funny, isn't it? The image of those 19th century archaeologists, so certain in their worldview, carefully documenting the grave of a great male chieftain. They saw exactly what they expected to see. Their own cultural biases acted as a filter, preventing them from even considering an alternative. They weren't bad scientists. They were simply products of their time, just as we are, products of ours. It makes you wonder what we are currently looking at, in museums or in the ground, that we are completely misinterpreting because of our own modern assumptions. What other legends are lying in wait, dismissed as fantasy, that are actually just waiting for the right technology or the right shift in perspective to be revealed as truth. Let's think about her horses, a Marais and a Stallion, a matched pair. This wasn't just about providing a mount for the afterlife. It was about projecting an image of immense status. Horses were expensive to buy, expensive to keep, and essential for rapid movement on land. For a military leader, they represented speed, command, and control of the landscape. The fact that she had two, and that they were sacrificed for her, speaks volumes about her importance to the community of Burqa. They were giving up a significant asset. It was a testament to her value. You don't make that kind of sacrifice for someone who is merely a figurehead. You do it for someone whose leadership was real and deeply felt. You could almost hear the whinny of the horses, their hooves stamping nervously on the packed earth, their warm breath misting in the cold Scandinavian air on the day of the funeral. A sad, solemn, but necessary part of sending their commander on her final journey. And so, the story of Grave BJ 581 is not just the story of one woman. It is the story of how we study the past, and how the past can reach out and change the present. It's a lesson in humility, a reminder to question our assumptions and to be open to the possibility that the truth is far more complex and surprising than the simple stories we tell ourselves. The Shield Maiden is not a comic book character. She is not a fantastical warrior princess. She is a 10th century woman, a human being of bone and blood who held a position of power in a complex society, and who was buried with the full honors befitting her rank. Her story, once a legend, is now a part of our shared human history. And as the evening deepens around you, and the world outside your window grows quiet, let that thought settle. The past is not a dead and buried thing. It is a place of sleeping giants and hidden truths, waiting for us to listen. That quiet hum of history, sleeping just beneath the surface, is not confined to the cold north. Let's leave the damp chill of Burqa behind. Let your mind drift, pulling away from the gray lake and the green birch trees, traveling south and east. You're moving across continents, over the dark, sprawling forests of Europe, across the glittering thread of the Bosphorus, and into the vast, rugged landscapes of Anatolia and beyond. The air grows warmer, drier. The scent of pine and damp earth is replaced by dust, dry grass, and exotic spices you can't quite name. Our destination is a different kind of fortress, in a different kind of world. We are heading to the formidable Elburz mountain range in what is now modern-day Iran. The journey here, even in your imagination, is an arduous one. You are climbing not up a gentle grassy slope, but on a winding, treacherous path carved into the side of a mountain. Below you, the world falls away into a dizzying abyss. Above you, jagged peaks of red and brown rock claw at a sapphire blue sky. The air is thin here, nearly 7,000 feet above sea level. Every breath is a conscious effort. This is not a place where people live by accident. To be here, you must want to be here, and you must be willing to endure the climb. This is a landscape designed by nature for defense, and it is here, perched on a razor-thin ridge of rock, that we find the ruins of our next legend. You have arrived at the Castle of Alamet, the Eagle's Nest. For nearly 200 years, this was the headquarters of a mysterious order that terrorized the rulers of the medieval world, a group whose very name has become synonymous with politically motivated murder, the Assassins. And at the heart of their legend is a story so potent, so seductive, that it has captivated writers and artists for centuries. The story of a secret garden of paradise, a fake heaven on earth used to create the most loyal and fearless killers the world had ever known. Like the Shield Maiden, the story of the assassins and their paradise is one we largely thought we understood, a lurid tale of drugs, manipulation, and fanatical devotion. But the truth, as it so often is is buried under layers of propaganda, misunderstanding, and the deliberate destruction of history. To find it, we have to first meet the man who started it all. He is known to history as Hasan-i-Sabbah, the Old, Man of the Mountain. Forget the image of a decadent cult leader. The real Hasan was a figure of intense discipline, a brilliant theologian, a political revolutionary, and a master of psychological warfare. Born in the mid-11th century, he was a member of the Nizari Ismailis, a minority sect within Shia Islam. This is the crucial mainstream fact you need to understand their story. The Ismailis were considered heretics by the ruling power of the region, the Sunni Seljuk Empire. They were persecuted, hunted, and killed for their beliefs. They were a people without a homeland, scattered and vulnerable. Hasan's goal was to carve out a safe territory for his people, a state of their own where they could live and worship freely. But he had no army, no great treasury, no vast lands to draw upon. He was David facing a colossal Goliath. Open warfare was suicide. So he devised a new strategy, a form of asymmetrical warfare that would allow his small, dedicated group to strike at the heart of the massive empire that surrounded them. He needed a base, an impregnable fortress from which to operate. And he found it here at Alamet. The castle was already built when he arrived in 1090, held by a local lord. Hasan didn't storm the castle with an army he didn't have. He took it through infiltration and cunning. Over months, his agents secretly converted the garrison, one soldier at a time. When the time was right, Hasan simply walked in and declared the castle his. The lord, realizing he was a king with no subjects, had no choice but to leave. There's a quirky, likely apocryphal story about this transaction. The lord supposedly agreed to sell Hasan as much land as could be encompassed by a single bull's hide. Hasan, in a display of clever thinking, had the hide cut into a single, incredibly thin, continuous thread, which he then used to encircle the entire fortress, claiming it for his own. It's probably just a legend, but it perfectly captures the spirit of the man, a leader who won not with brute force, but with a sharper mind. Once ensconced in his eagle's nest, Hasan-i-Sabbah established his order. From this remote stronghold, he and his successors would dispatch their agents, known as Faida'i, or devotees, to eliminate key enemy figures, viziers, generals, caliphs. These agents were masters of disguise, often spending months or even years infiltrating an enemy's court, learning their routines, gaining their trust, waiting for the perfect moment to strike with a dagger. They were disciplined, intelligent, and utterly devoted. And this is where the legend of the Paradise Garden begins, an attempt to explain the source of such terrifying loyalty. The most famous and detailed account comes from the Venetian traveler Marco Polo, who passed through the region in the 1270s, more than a decade after the Mongols had sacked Alamet and destroyed the order. It's important to remember he was hearing stories, not witnessing events, but the story he told was a blockbuster. Let's immerse ourselves in his telling of the tale. You are a young man, a new recruit to the cause, brought to the fortress of Alamet. You are strong, brave, and chosen for your potential. You meet the old man of the mountain, Hasan-i-Sabbah, a charismatic figure whose words of faith and purpose stir your soul. He speaks of the corrupt Seljuk rulers, the oppression of your people, and the promise of a glorious reward in the afterlife for those who serve the cause. One evening, you are invited to his chambers. You are given a drink, a sweet, spiced wine. As you drink, a strange lethargy creeps over you. The room begins to spin, the torchlight dissolving into soft, hazy patterns. Your mind goes dim, and you fall into a deep, dreamless sleep. You awake not to the cold stone of the fortress, but to something impossible. You are lying on a bed of soft moss, surrounded by the most beautiful garden you have ever seen. The air is warm and fragrant. with the scent of 1,000 flowers, roses, jasmine, honeysuckle. The sky is a perfect, cloudless blue. Fountains, lined with polished marble, gurgle with clear, cool water. You hear the sound of music, the gentle plucking of lutes, and the sweet melodies of unseen singers. You rise to your feet, your head still, a little foggy, and begin to explore. You see channels flowing not with water, but with wine, milk, and honey, just as the Quran describes the rivers of paradise. The trees are laden with the most delicious fruits, pomegranates, with jewel-like seeds, ripe figs bursting with sweetness, dates like lumps of caramel. And then you see them, the maidens, the houris, beautiful beyond all earthly comparison, dressed in flowing silks. They greet you with warm smiles, offering you fruits and wine in golden cups. They speak to you in soft, musical voices, attend to your every need, and treat you as if you are the most important person in existence. For a few days, you live in this state of perfect bliss. You experience every pleasure of the senses. This is it. This has to be Jannah, the paradise promised to the faithful. You have no doubt that the old man of the mountain is a true prophet, for only he could have given you a taste of heaven itself. Then, just as before, you are given a drink. You fall once more into a drugged sleep, and you awaken back in the cold, Spartan reality of Alamet, lying on your simple cot. You are brought before Hazan-i Sabah. He looks at you with his knowing eyes and asks, "Where have you been?" You tell him, stammering with awe, that you have been in paradise. "You are right," he says, "and it is my will that you can return there. But the only way to that permanent bliss is through absolute obedience to my commands. If you die in my service, my angels will carry your soul back to that garden, where you will remain for all eternity. From that moment on, you have no fear of death. Why would you? Death is not an end. It is a doorway back to the perfect happiness you have already tasted. You are now a perfect instrument of Hazan's will, a Fida ready to undertake any mission, no matter how dangerous, for the promise of that eternal reward. It's an incredible story. It's a story of ultimate psychological manipulation, a brilliant and diabolical scheme to create fearless super soldiers. And for centuries, the Western world, in particular, accepted it as fact. The very word assassin was thought to derive from hashishin, or user of hashish, supposedly the drug used to induce the stupor dot. It's a compelling narrative, but it's almost certainly a fabrication. This is where we must again step back from the legend and look at the evidence. Historians still argue whether this legend was a complete fiction created by the assassin's enemies, or if it was perhaps based on some kind of less literal symbolic or initiatory practice. A consensus, however, leans heavily towards it being propaganda. Firstly, as mentioned, Marco Polo heard the story secondhand, long after the fact. Secondly, there are no Nizari Ismaili sources that describe anything like this. Their own writings focus on theology, philosophy, and history, not secret pleasure gardens. Thirdly, the archaeological and geographical reality of Alamet makes the legend highly improbable. The fortress is on a narrow, arid rock ridge. Creating and maintaining a lush, watered garden with flowing fountains in such a location would have been a monumental, if not impossible, feat of engineering, and one that surely would have been noticed. So if there was no magic garden, what was the truth? The reality is, in many ways, far more impressive. The loyalty of the Fidai was not secured with drugs and illusions, but with faith, education, and a profound sense of community. Alamet and the other Nizari castles were not hedonistic cult compounds. They were centers of learning and refuge. Hazan-i Sabah, far from being a debauched puppet master, lived an incredibly austere life. He was a scholar and a zealot. He even had his own sons executed for infractions of his strict code of conduct one for drinking wine, the other on suspicion of murder. This was not a man given to earthly pleasures. His fortress, Alunat, was famous for its magnificent library, which housed priceless manuscripts on science, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. Scholars from all over the Muslim world, and even beyond, were drawn to it. This was an intellectual and spiritual center, a beacon of learning in a turbulent world. A far cry from the drug den of Marco Polo's tale, the famous assassin name itself is a misunderstanding. The term Hashishia, as it was used by their enemies in Arabic, was a derogatory slur. It didn't literally mean hashish smokers. It was more akin to calling a group rabble, outcasts, or people of low morals. It was an insult. European crusaders, hearing this term and not understanding its pejorative social context, took it literally. They connected it to the wild. Stories of fanatical killers, and the legend of the hashish-fueled assassin was born. A misunderstanding of a single word, layered on top of enemy propaganda, created a myth that has lasted for 800 years. It's a bit like a medieval game of telephone, where the message gets more and more distorted with each retelling. You can almost picture a crusader knight trying to explain it back home. They're called hash somethings, and their leader gives them this stuff called hashish, and they'll do anything for him. It's a joke, really, how such a massive legend can be built on such a flimsy foundation. The real training of a Fidei was a long and arduous process. They were chosen for their intelligence, physical fitness, and most importantly, their devout faith. They would spend years at Alunat, studying Ismaili theology, learning languages, Arabic, Persian, Turkish, and mastering the arts of espionage in disguise. They were more like a combination of a monk, a scholar, and a modern-day special forces operative. Their motivation was not a drug-induced hallucination of paradise, but a deep-seated belief in the righteousness of their cause and the promise of a spiritual, not literal, paradise after a martyr's death. They were fighting for the survival of their community and their faith in a world that wanted to eradicate them. The paradise Hazan Sabah offered was arguably the fortress itself, a place of safety, intellectual freedom, and profound spiritual purpose in a hostile world. For a young, persecuted Ismaili, the chance to join this elite, disciplined order and strike back at their oppressors would have been a powerful draw. No drugs required. The recruitment process must have been less like a cult initiation and more like the most intense job interview of your life, testing not just your skills, but the very depths of your conviction. Imagine being one of these agents. Your mission is to eliminate a powerful Seljuk vizier. You don't storm his palace. Instead, you spend a year working your way into his household. Perhaps you take a job as a stable hand, then a cook's assistant, then a scribe. You learn the layout of the palace, the routines of the guards, the vizier's habits. You are patient, unassuming, invisible. You bide your time, waiting for the one moment of vulnerability. Then, on the chosen day, in a crowded mosque or a busy marketplace, you make your move. You strike quickly, decisively, with a dagger. You rarely try to escape. To die in the act was the point. It was an act of martyrdom, a public statement. The psychological impact of these attacks was enormous. The Seljuk lords began to fear shadows. They couldn't trust their own bodyguards, their own servants. The threat wasn't an army at the gates. It was the quiet man who served them wine, the new recruit in their own guard. The assassins ruled not through territory, but through terror and influence. It was a remarkably effective strategy that allowed a small community to hold its own against a superpower for over 150 years. Comparing this reality to the legend of the Shield Maiden is fascinating. With the Burqa warrior, we had a legend that was dismissed as fantasy, only for archaeology to provide concrete, physical proof of its reality. Here, With the Assassin's Paradise, we have the opposite. We have a legend that was widely accepted as fact, but a closer look at the historical and archaeological evidence reveals it to be almost certainly a fiction. A ghost story created by enemies to demonize a group they couldn't defeat on the battlefield. It's a reminder that history isn't just about what happened, but about who gets to tell the story. For centuries, the only story we had of the Nizari Ismailis was the one told by their enemies, Marco Polo and the Crusaders. The end for Alamut and the Nizari state came not from the Seljuks, but from an even more terrifying force, the Mongols. In 1256, the armies of Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, swept into Persia. The Mongols were a force of nature, an unstoppable tide that flattened cities and toppled empires. They laid siege to Alamut. For all its natural defenses, the eagles' nest could not hold out forever against the relentless Mongol siege engines. The last Ismaili leader, Rukn al-Din Khorshah, surrendered in the hope of saving his people. Hulagu Khan accepted the surrender, then betrayed him. He had Khorshah executed and ordered the complete destruction of Alamut. The fortress was torn down, but most devastatingly, its magnificent library was put to the torch. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, works of science, philosophy, poetry, and the entire history of the Nizari Ismailis from their own perspective going up in flames. It was a cultural cataclysm. With that fire, the assassin's own voice was effectively erased from history. All that was left were the echoes, the stories told by their enemies. The legend of the Paradise Garden survived not because it was true, but because the truth was turned to ash. We are left with a ghost, a caricature. It's a bit like imagining that in 1,000 years, the only surviving record of our modern world was a collection of attack ads from a particularly nasty political campaign. You'd get a picture, but it would be a grotesque and wildly inaccurate one. And it's why the job of the historian is so crucial: to sift through the propaganda, to read between the lines of hostile accounts, and to try and reconstruct a more balanced truth from the fragments that remained out. So, as you stand on the windswept ruins of Alamut, the jagged peaks stark against the sky, you can see the two stories hanging in the air. One is the lurid fantasy of the secret garden, a tale of exotic temptation and mind control. The other is the more complex, more human story of a persecuted people who created a sanctuary of faith and learning, and who defended it with a disciplined and deadly intelligence. The legend is exciting, but the reality is, in its own way, far more compelling. It is a testament to the power of human belief, ingenuity, and the will to survive against impossible odds. The paradise wasn't a place of earthly pleasures. It was an idea, the idea of freedom, the idea of justice. And for the Faidai, that was an idea worth dying for. No illusions necessary. The air is clear and quiet now. The ghosts of Hezanai, Sabah and his devotees long since faded. But the power of their story, both the legend and the reality, still clings to these stones. A whisper on the mountain wind. The whispers on that mountain wind carry us away from the stark, solid reality of Alamut stone. We leave behind a story where the legend was a lie, but the place and the people were terrifyingly real. Now we drift into a different sort of myth altogether. We are searching for a kingdom that was perhaps never made of stone at all, but of parchment and ink, of hope and desperation. Unlike the Shield Maiden's grave, there was no body to unearth, no DNA to test. And unlike Alamut's library, there was no truth to be burned, because the truth was never the point. We are going in search of a ghost, a phantom empire ruled by a man who never lived, but who changed the course of history anyway. We are looking for the kingdom of Prester John Dot, to understand why this legend took such a powerful hold on the medieval mind. You have to place yourself in the precarious world of 12th century Europe. You are living in a time of intense religious fervor. The First Crusade, a few decades earlier, had been a shocking success, capturing Jerusalem and establishing a handful of fragile Christian states in the Holy Land. But now, the tide is turning. The year is 1145, and devastating news has just arrived from the east. The city of Edessa, one of the key Crusader strongholds, has fallen to the armies of Imad al-Din Zendi, a powerful Muslim ruler. A wave of fear ripples across Christendom. The foothold in the Holy Land feels like it's about to crumble. Panic and despair are setting in. Into this atmosphere of crisis walks a man named Hugh, the Bishop of Jabala, a coastal city in what is now Syria. He has traveled to Rome to speak with the Pope Eugenius III. He confirms the bad news about Edessa. But then he offers a sliver of hope, a story he has heard from the East. He speaks of a mighty Christian king, a Nestorian Christian, who lives in the mysterious lands far beyond Persia and Armenia. This king, he says, is a descendant of one of the three Magi who visited the infant Jesus. His name is John, and he is also a presbyter, a priest. Hence Prester John. Just a few years earlier, this Prester John had led his armies against the Persians, defeating them in a great battle. He was, the bishop says, marching west with the intent of coming to Jerusalem to help his Christian brethren fight their enemies. He was only turned back by the impassable Tigris River. Imagine you are in the papal court, listening to this. After so much bad news, this is a bombshell of pure optimism. A secret Christian ally, a super king from the east, a new Magi, coming to save the day. It's the perfect antidote to the prevailing gloom. The story spreads, a rumor of salvation that people desperately want to believe. For 20 years, the legend of Prester John bubbles just under the surface. A comforting thought, a piece of hopeful gossip. And then, in the year 1165, the legend explodes. A letter appears, and it begins to circulate among the courts of Europe. It is a letter allegedly written by Prester John himself, addressed to the Byzantine Emperor, Manuel I Komnenos, with copies seemingly sent to the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope as well. And this letter is one of the most magnificent, outlandish, and imaginative documents of the entire Middle Ages. Let's open it. Imagine the parchment, heavy and smelling of ink and ambition. The voice that speaks from it is not that of a humble, a lie, but of the most powerful and pious ruler in existence. I, Prester John, it begins, am the Lord of Lords, and I surpass all the kings of the entire earth in virtue, in riches, and in power. It's a bold opening statement, and he's just getting started. He describes his kingdom, the Three Indias, as a utopia, a land of wonders that would make any European monarch weep with envy. Your mind begins to paint the picture as you read. He says his lands flow with milk and honey. There are no poor people. There is no theft, no flattery, no avarice, no division. No lies are ever told. The people live in perfect harmony. It sounds nice, a standard utopian dream. But then the details become fantastical. He writes of a river called the Adonis, which flows from the Garden of Paradise itself. But this river is not filled with water. It is filled with precious stones. It flows through his lands 3 days a week, and you can gather as many emeralds, sapphires, and rubies as you desire. You have to imagine the absurdity of the logistics. A river of jewels. How inconvenient it must be when the channel gets clogged. With a particularly large diamond, the wonders pile up, each one more incredible than the last. In one of his provinces, there is a sea of sand, without a drop of water, which ebbs and flows just like a real ocean. In another, a subterranean river emerges for 4 days a week, and its waters can cure any disease. In his deserts, he claims, live horned men, fauns, satyrs, and pygmies. He rules over the Amazons and the Brahmins. His palace is a marvel of crystal and gold. The ceilings are studded with gems. The gates are made of sardonyx, the doors of horn, so they cannot be broken. Wildlife in his kingdom is equally bizarre. He speaks of giant ants that dig for gold, and of great white lions and elephants that are trained for war. But the star of his menagerie is the salamander. He writes that salamanders live in fire, and they spin a cocoon like a silkworm. His court ladies spin this fiery thread and weave it into cloth and robes. These garments can only be cleaned by throwing them into a blazing fire. Imagine trying to get insurance for a wardrobe of salamander wool suits. It's pure, delightful fantasy. This is our quirky tidbit for the evening. A king who claims to wear fireproof pajamas, made from the magical cocoons of a mythical lizard. He also boasts of his advanced technology. At the top of his palace sits a gigantic mirror, which he can climb up to via a winding staircase. From this vantage point, he can see everything that is happening in all of his provinces, no matter how distant. It is the ultimate surveillance state, a medieval crystal ball on an epic scale. He knows of every plot, every secret, every betrayal before it happens. And his military might is unmatched. When he rides to war, he is preceded by 13 giant golden crosses, each followed by 10,000 horsemen and 100,000 foot soldiers. That's over 1.4 million soldiers, an army of impossible size for the medieval world. And at the heart of all this power and wealth, he presents himself as the most humble and devout of Christians. He explains his title, Prester John, is because his piety is so great that he refuses any grander title than that of a simple priest. His steward is an archbishop, his treasurer a bishop, his chamberlain a patriarch. His court is a perfect fusion of temporal power and spiritual purity. He even claims that the fountain of youth is located within his lands, and anyone who bathes in it will be returned to the age of 32. The letter is a masterpiece of world building. It's a catalog of every marvel, every myth, every strange beast that Europeans had ever dreamed existed in the mysterious East. It was, in short, irresistible. For the rulers of Europe, caught up in their petty squabbles, their muddy, plague-ridden cities, and their endless, grinding wars, this letter was a vision of a better world. It was proof that a perfect Christian society was not just a dream for the afterlife, but a reality on earth. And most importantly, its ruler was their ally. The reaction was electric. Copies of the letter were made and spread throughout Europe, translated into numerous languages. People were captivated, and the papacy took it seriously. This is our mainstream historical fact. The legend of Prester John was a direct and powerful influence on European geopolitics and religion. Pope Alexander III, facing his own struggles with the Holy Roman Emperor, saw a potential game-changing ally. In 1177, he wrote a letter in reply, addressing Prester John as the illustrious and magnificent king of the Indies. He praised John's faith and gently corrected a few of his theological errors before inviting him to collaborate. He entrusted this papal letter to his personal physician Philip, charging him with the monumental task of finding Prester John's kingdom and delivering the message. And what happened to Philip? He sets off to the east and vanishes. He is never heard from again. He disappears from the historical record completely, a man swallowed by a myth. It's the medieval equivalent of your package getting lost in the mail, with the tracking status permanently stuck on, out for delivery. But the disappearance of one envoy didn't stop the search. The quest for Prester John became a European obsession. If he existed, he had to be found. And if he had to be found, he had to be somewhere. So cartographers started to put him on the map, literally. At first, they placed his kingdom in the Indies, a vague term that could mean anything from India to Central Asia, The stories of St. Thomas the Apostle, having evangelized in India, made it a logical starting point. When Marco Polo made his famous journey along the Silk Road, one of his unofficial objectives was to find any trace of this Christian king. He found Nestorian Christian communities, yes, but no mighty empire, no river of jewels. So the kingdom moved. In the 13th century, a new power rose from the steppes of Central Asia, the Mongols. As the armies of Genghis Khan swept across the continent, strange rumors reached Europe. Rumors that this powerful new Khan was, in fact, a Christian. The Nestorians had been active missionaries in Asia, and some tribes had converted. One powerful leader, Togrul, the Khan of the Karaites and an ally of the young Genghis Khan, was a Nestorian Christian. European chroniclers, desperate to fit reality into their preferred narrative, latched onto this. Togrul, they reasoned, must be Prester John, or perhaps his son or his brother. For a while, the search shifted to the heart of the Mongol Empire. But this hope, too, faded as the Mongols eventually adopted Islam or Buddhism, and their conquering armies turned towards Europe itself, becoming not a source of salvation, but a terrifying new threat. The kingdom had to move again. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the search had a new focus: Africa. Europeans had long known of the ancient Christian kingdom of Ethiopia, or Abyssinia, but it was isolated, a Christian island in a sea of Islamic states, cut off from contact with Rome for centuries. As Portuguese explorers began to cautiously sail down the coast of Africa, their motives were twofold: find a sea route to the spices of the actual Indies, and find the kingdom of Prester John. They believed that if they could link up with this powerful African Christian king, they could form a grand alliance, a pincer movement against the Ottoman Empire, which had conquered Constantinople and now threatened Europe itself. For centuries, Ethiopia became the final settled home of Prester John's kingdom. When the Portuguese finally made sustained contact with the Ethiopian emperor in the early 16th century, they were convinced they had found him. The Ethiopians, for their part, were a bit bewildered by this, but were happy to have European allies against their own local rivals. The legend had finally found a real place to land, even if the reality of Ethiopia, rugged, ancient, and very real kingdom with its own complex history, bore no resemblance to the fantasy land of Salamander. Wool and jewel-filled rivers. So what was the truth behind the letter that started it all? It was almost certainly a forgery, and a brilliant one at that. So where did it come from? This brings us to another scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the letter was a sophisticated hoax designed to inspire religious fervor and maybe a new crusade, or if it was primarily a work of political and social satire. The evidence suggests it was likely written in Germany during the turbulent reign of Frederick Barbarossa. It could have been a piece of wish fulfillment, a way of imagining a perfect emperor who combined the power of a king with the piety of a priest, something Barbarossa was constantly struggling with in his conflict with the Pope. It could also have been a critique of European society. By describing a kingdom with no poverty, no lies, and no corruption, the author was holding up a mirror to the all-too-obvious failings of 12th century feudal Europe. But here is the most fascinating part of the entire legend. Prester John was fake. His kingdom was a fantasy. His letter was a forgery. And yet, the impact of this fake story was incredibly real. The desire to find this mythical ally was a major driving force behind the Age of Discovery. It pushed explorers out of their comfort zones, motivated them to chart unknown waters, and map new coastlines. The search for a phantom helped to create the first true maps of the world. It's a profound irony. In their desperate search for a fictional Christian king in Africa, the Portuguese charted the continent, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and opened up the sea route to the real Indies, fundamentally changing global trade and politics forever. A lie, it turns out, can sometimes be a very powerful catalyst for discovering the truth. It's a joke on a global scale. Humanity's geography homework got done because everyone was trying to find a guy who didn't exist. The story of Prester John is a powerful lesson in the nature of belief. People believed in him because they needed to. In a world of uncertainty and fear, he was a symbol of hope, a guarantee that they were not alone, that victory was ultimately assured. His legend shows us how hungry the human mind is for stories, and how those stories can shape our actions. In the real world, sometimes for generations. Unlike the Shield Maiden, who is a real person whose story was turned into a legend, Prester John was a legend who people tried desperately to turn into a real person. They projected their hopes onto the blank spaces of the map, and then sailed into those empty spaces to try and make their dreams a reality. And in doing so, they filled in those blanks forever. As you let your mind drift, you can imagine those medieval maps with huge unknown continents labeled, "Here be dragons." And in the middle of one of them, a hopeful cartographer carefully inks a drawing of a crown and writes, "The land of Prester John," a testament not to a real king, but to the unconquerable power of human hope, a echo of that hopeful quest for a kingdom that never was fades. And the vast, sun-scorched emptiness of the map begins to fill with a different kind of landscape. Pull your mind's eye away from the imagined courts of Asia and Africa, away from the grand geopolitical dreams of popes and kings. We are traveling west now, back to the fringes of Europe, to a place that medieval mapmakers often considered a land of myth in its own right. We are going to the island of Ireland, but not the rolling green fields of postcards. We are venturing into the Ireland of the 12th century, a place of dense, primeval forests, of misty bogs and hidden valleys, a land steeped in a history far older than the Christian cathedrals of the continent. Here, the legends are not of distant saviors, but of curses that cling to the very soil, to the bloodlines of families. We are trading a myth of hope for a myth of fear, and we are going to meet a monster who prays to God. Our guide on this journey is a man named Gerald of Wales, or Geraldus Cambrensis. He was a real person, a churchman and writer, born around 1146. He was a product of the new order of things, part Norman, part Welsh, educated in Paris, ambitious and incredibly curious. In the late 1180s, he accompanied Prince John of England on a trip to Ireland, a land his Norman relatives were in the process of conquering. He wrote a book about his experiences called the Topographia Hibernica, or Topography of Ireland. It is a fascinating, frustrating, and utterly bizarre document. In it, he describes the island's geography, its wildlife, and its people. And, to him, Ireland was a land of wonders and monstrosities, a place where the normal rules of nature seemed to break down. He writes of barnacle geese that grow on trees, of islands where no one ever dies, and of saints whose bodies refuse to decay. And it is here, in this blend of observation and wild rumor, that he records, as if it were a factual report, the story of the werewolves of OSSORY. So let the world around you dissolve. You are no longer in your room. The air grows cool and damp, thick with the smell of wet earth, moss, and decaying leaves. You are a priest somewhere in the east of Ireland, in the ancient kingdom of Ossory. You are traveling from Ulster to Meath, but you have lost your way. The sun has set, and the forest has closed in around you, a tangled black maze of ancient oaks and gnarled thorns. The only light is the sliver of a crescent moon, and it does little to pierce the oppressive darkness. You are alone, save for a young boy traveling with you, and you are both deeply afraid. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sounds like a threat. You decide to make camp for the night. You gather what dry wood you can find, and with trembling hands, you manage to start a small fire. The flames push back the darkness, creating a tiny flickering bubble of safety in the immense. Hostile wilderness. You sit by the fire, reciting your evening prayers, your voice a small human sound in the vast silence of the woods. And then you hear it, a low growl, coming from the edge of the firelight. You freeze, your heart hammering in your chest. The boy beside you lets out a choked gasp. Peering into the shadows, you see a pair of eyes, glowing yellow in the reflected light of your fire. A wolf, and it is enormous. It pads slowly out of the darkness and into the clearing. But it does not snarl or lunge. It simply stands there, watching you with an unnerving intelligence. And then, the impossible happens. It speaks. Its voice is not a human voice. It is a rasping, guttural sound that seems to come from deep within its chest, the words formed around the shape of a wolf's snarl. But they are words in your own language. Do not be afraid, it says. You are, of course, utterly terrified. This is a demon, a trick of the devil. You make the sign of the cross, muttering an incantation against evil. The wolf does not recoil. Instead, it says something that shatters your reality. We are people from Ossory, it rasps, and we are from a clan that bears a terrible curse. You stare, speechless, as the wolf begins to tell its story. It speaks of a local saint, a holy man named Natalis, who had been wronged by the ancestors of the wolf's clan centuries ago. As a punishment for their crime, the saint laid a dreadful curse upon their entire lineage. The curse was this: every 7 years, 2 members of their clan, a man and a woman, are chosen. They are driven from their homes, and in the depths of the wilderness, they shed their human forms and become wolves. For 7 years, they must live as beasts, hunting and surviving in the wild. If they manage to survive the full 7 years, they can return. Their wolf skin falls away, they become human again, and they can go home. But the curse is not lifted. In their place, another pair from the clan must take their turn. It is an endless hereditary punishment. A bit more severe than a modern-day community service sentence, to be sure. It's an extreme way to get out. Of paying your taxes for a few years, but the lifestyle trade-off seems questionable. The wolf then explains why he has approached you. He and his wife are 2 years into their 7-year term, but his wife, the she-wolf, has fallen gravely ill. She is nearby, in their lair, and she is dying. She is a Christian. The wolf pleads, his yellow eyes filled with a desperate sorrow, and she is terrified of dying in the form of a beast, without the comfort of God. He begs you, as a man of God, to come and give her the last rites, the viaticum, the Holy Communion. Given to the dying Dot, your mind reels. Is this a trap? A monstrous deception to lure you to your doom? A priest's duty is to minister to the dying. But does that duty extend to a talking wolf? It seems like a situation the seminary failed to cover. You hesitate, torn between fear and faith. The wolf senses your doubt. If you do not believe me, it says, I will show you the truth. And then it does something so shocking, so profoundly strange, that it erases all your skepticism. The great wolf lifts a forepaw, and with its claws, it carefully, deliberately, hooks the skin on its own chest and pulls it down. The coarse, gray fur peels back like a cloak, and underneath, you see not the flesh of an animal, but the pale, wrinkled skin of an old man. The proof is there, undeniable and grotesque. Your fear is now replaced by a wave of pity and awe. This is no demon. This is a man, a fellow Christian, trapped in a monstrous form, suffering under a divine curse. Your duty is clear. You agree to go. The wolf leads you through the dark woods, to a hollow beneath the roots of a giant ancient tree. There, lying on a bed of dry leaves, is the she-wolf. She is breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. She cannot speak, but her eyes, like her husband's, are filled with a human intelligence and a deep, pleading sorrow. You are a priest in perhaps the strangest pastoral care visit in history. You kneel down, take out your holy implements, and you begin the rites. You offer the prayers for the dying, and you administer the holy sacrament to the she-wolf. She receives it with a profound reverence, and then, with a final, shuddering breath, she dies. The male wolf remains with you all night, not as a threat, but as a silent, grieving companion. He shares his fire, behaves with a gentle courtesy, and in the morning, he guides you out of the forest and sets you on the right path for your journey. Your life has been touched by a miracle, a terrible and beautiful wonder that you will never forget. This is the story that Gerald of Wales recorded in his book, and for centuries, it was read as a strange but true account from the magical land of Ireland. But what was really going on here? To understand the legend, we have to understand the storyteller. This is our mainstream historical fact. Gerald's writings were, in part, political propaganda. The Normans were invaders, justifying their conquest of Ireland by portraying the native Irish as pagans and savages, a people who lived outside the norms of Christian civilization. A story about a clan of Irishmen who literally turn into wolves fits that narrative perfectly. It's a way of saying, look at these people. They are not fully human like us. They are wild, monstrous, and in need of our civilizing influence. It was a political hit piece disguised as a travelogue, but Gerald probably didn't invent the story out of thin air. He was likely recording a local belief, a piece of Irish folklore that he then filtered through his own Norman Christian worldview. And if you dig beneath the Christian surface of the curse, you find something much older, something from the pre-Christian pagan past of Ireland. This brings us to a fascinating and quirky corner of Irish history, the wolf warrior cults. In ancient Ireland, certain bands of young warriors, known as Fianna, lived as outlaws in the wilderness as a rite of passage. They were often associated with wolves. They wore wolf skins, took on wolf names, and were known for their ferg, or battle frenzy, in which they were said to take on the ferocity and strength of a wolf. They were the Lainich Felid, the wolf men of Leinster. For these warriors, becoming a wolf was not a curse, but a source of power, a shamanic transformation that turned them into the ultimate fighter. It was a respected, if feared, part of their warrior culture. So what Gerald likely heard was a distorted, Christianized folk memory of these ancient wolf warrior traditions. Over the centuries, as Ireland converted to Christianity, these pagan practices came to be seen as something dark and demonic. The voluntary, power-seeking transformation of the warrior became the involuntary, punitive curse of the saint. The source of pride for a clan became its source of shame. The story the wolf tells the priest of a curse laid by Saint Natales is a perfect example of how Christianity often absorbed and reinterpreted older pagan beliefs, turning gods into demons and sacred rites into curses. And this is where we find our scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether these accounts of wolf warriors and werewolves were purely symbolic, or if they hint at something more. Were they just men acting like wolves, or did they engage in shamanic rituals to achieve a state of spiritual transformation where they truly believed they had become wolves? Could there have been a psychological element, a recognized form of mental illness like clinical lycanthropy, where individuals suffer from the delusion that they are an animal? The stories are so persistent, not just in Ireland, but across the Norse world. The famous Viking berserkers are another example, that they suggest a deep-seated belief in the permeability of the boundary between human and beast. The story wasn't just confined to Ireland either. A 13th century Norse educational text, the Konungsskuggsjar, King's Mirror, also describes the wonders of Ireland, and it too mentions werewolves. It repeats the story of a divine curse that forces men to turn into wolves and roam the woods. The fact that the story was being told by the Norse as well shows how widespread this perception of Ireland was. It was the weird west of the medieval European world, a place where anything could happen. This Irish version of the werewolf legend is also strikingly different from what was developing in continental Europe. In France and Germany, by the later Middle Ages, the werewolf was almost exclusively seen as a servant of the devil. A man became a werewolf by making a satanic pact, using a magic ointment, or donning an enchanted wolf pelt. They were figures of pure evil, who slaughtered livestock and ate children. They were hunted, put on trial, and executed. But the werewolves of Ossory are different. They are not evil. They are victims of a curse, but they retain their human reason and, most importantly, their Christian faith. The wolf in Gerald's story doesn't want to eat the priest. He wants a priest's blessing. It's a uniquely sympathetic and tragic portrayal of the werewolf, one that feels deeply rooted in a more complex folkloric tradition rather than a simple theological dichotomy of good and evil. So, the legend of the werewolves of Ossory is a fascinating tangle of threads. It is a piece of Norman propaganda, a Christian reinterpretation of a pagan warrior tradition, and a uniquely Irish contribution to the universal myth of the shapeshifter. It's a story that tells us less about actual men turning into wolves, and more about how cultures view each other, and how they view their own past. When the priest kneels in the dark forest to give communion to a dying she-wolf, he is at the crossroads of history, where the pagan and Christian worlds collide, where folklore and theology meet. And as you let this strange, sad story settle, in your mind, you can almost hear the howl of that lone wolf in the forests of Ossory, a cry not of savagery, but of grief, a lament for a human soul trapped in the body of a beast. The mournful howl of the Ossory wolf fades into the mists of the Irish forest, and we leave that story of primal fear and cursed identity behind. Our journey now takes us across the Irish Sea, to the east, to the gently rolling countryside of England. We are moving from a legend rooted in the dark, ancient fears of the wilderness to something else entirely. This is not a story of a human transformed into a beast we recognize, but of something arriving in our world that seems utterly alien, a mystery that is less about horror and more about a profound and unsettling wonder. We are leaving the world of curses and heading to a world of questions. We find ourselves in a small, unremarkable village in the county of Suffolk, a village with the strange and evocative name of Woolpit. The time is the middle of the 12th century, during the reign of King Stephen. English history knows this period as the Anarchy, a long and brutal civil war between Stephen and his cousin, Empress Matilda, who were fighting for the throne. It was a time of chaos, of shifting loyalties and local violence. But here in Woolpit, far from the great battles, life goes on with the familiar rhythmic certainty of the seasons. And it's during one of those seasons, the autumn harvest, that something happens which will ensure this tiny village is remembered for the next 900 years. This is not a story that comes from a saga or a poem. It was recorded as a true event by two separate and well-respected chroniclers of the time. One was Ralph of Coggeshall, the abbot of a Cistercian monastery, who wrote his account around the year 1220, claiming he had heard the story from the man who had taken the children into his own home. The other was William of Newburgh, a historian, and canon at an Augustinian priory in Yorkshire. He wrote his version a little earlier, around 1190, and insisted he recorded it based on numerous reliable testimonies. These were not tellers of tall tales. They were serious men, reporting what they believed to be a factual, if inexplicable, historical event. Now, place yourself in that time, in that village. The sun is warm on your back. The air is hazy with the dust of the harvest. You are reaper, working in the fields that surround Woolpit. The work is back-breaking, a constant rhythm of swinging your scythe, gathering the stalks, and binding them into sheaves. It is the same work your father did, and his father before him. The sounds are familiar. The swish of the blades through the dry stalks, the chatter of your fellow villagers, the buzzing of insects in the late summer heat. Your world is small, predictable, and bounded by the church spire at its center and the dark woods at its edge. And at the edge of the village are the wolf pits, from which the town gets its name. These are deep, cone-shaped ditches, dug and disguised to trap the wolves that are a constant threat to the village's livestock. They are a feature of the landscape, a reminder of the ever-present danger that lurks just beyond the cultivated fields. On this particular day, as you work, a strange sound cuts through the familiar noises of the harvest. It's a faint, high-pitched noise, not quite a cry, not quite speech. It sounds like a frantic chirping. The work stops. Everyone looks around, confused. The sound is coming from the direction of the wolf pits. Cautiously, a group of you leave your scythes and walk towards the pits. You approach one of them, a deep shadow in the sun-drenched field, and you peer over the edge. And what you see makes you recoil in shock and disbelief. Huddled at the bottom of the pit are two children, a boy and a slightly older girl. They are terrified, weeping, and chattering to each other in a frantic, incomprehensible language. But that is not what makes you gasp. It is the color of their skin. It is not the pale white of an English villager, nor the sun-brown tone of a field worker. Their skin is unmistakably green, not a sickly, pale green, but a distinct, vibrant green hue, like the color of young leaves. Their clothes, too, are strange, made of a texture and color of fabric you have never seen before. Everything about them is foreign, otherworldly. This would be the most exciting and terrifying thing to happen in your village since, well, ever. Word spreads through the village like wildfire. The children are carefully helped out of the pit. They are terrified of the crowd of strange, pale-skinned giants who surround them. They are brought from the fields and taken to the home of a respected local knight, Sir Richard de Colin. The entire village is in an uproar of speculation. Are they demons? Fairies from the nearby woods? Omen bearers? Or just children? In Sir Richard's hall, the lady of the house offers them food. Freshly baked bread, a staple of your diet. The children stare at it blankly and push it away. They are offered meat from the roasting spit, cheese, all the food of your world. They refuse everything, turning away and continuing to weep. They are clearly starving, their faces gaunt, but they will not eat. Days pass, and the villagers begin to fear the strange green children will simply waste away. Then, someone has an idea. The harvest is not just of grain, but of vegetables from the small garden plots. A group of villagers comes into the hall, carrying armfuls of freshly picked broad beans, the stalks still attached. The moment the children see the beans, their demeanor changes. They stop crying. With frantic gestures, they indicate that they want them. When the beans are placed before them, they fall upon them ravenously. But they don't shell them. They tear open the stalks themselves, searching for the beans within. The chronicles are very specific about this detail. They found the beans inside, the stalks bitter and inedible, and wept again, until the villagers showed them how to open the pods. For a long time after that, raw broad beans were the only food they would touch. Forget the picky eaters of our modern world who won't touch their broccoli. These children were on an exclusive and very specific raw bean diet. Life settles into a strange new routine. The green children live in the household of Sir Richard, subsisting on their diet of beans. But they are not thriving. The boy, who was younger and seemed weaker from the start, grows more and more lethargic and depressed. He languishes, and within a year of their arrival, he dies. The girl, however, proves to be more resilient. She begins to cautiously try other foods, bread, then milk, then other things. Slowly, miraculously, as her diet diversifies, her strange green skin color begins to fade, replaced by the normal pale complexion of the people around her. She is brought to the church and baptized, given the name Agnes. She is taught to speak English, which she picks up over time, her own strange, chirping language fading from memory. She grows up in the knight's household, a local curiosity who, over the years, becomes just another member of the community, the living evidence of a miracle or a mystery that no one could explain. But of course, once she could speak your language, there was one question everyone in Woolpit wanted to ask her. Where did you come from? Who are your people? Why were you green? And Agnes, the girl from the wolf pit, gave them an answer. An answer that was, in its own way, even stranger than her first appearance. Let your mind settle into the quiet of a medieval hall, lit by a crackling fire. You are sitting with Agnes. She is a young woman now, no longer green, but the memory of her arrival still hangs about her like a strange perfume. And you ask her to tell her story. She says she and her brother came from a place called St. Martin's Land. It was not a land like yours. The sun, she says, never rose there. They lived in a state of perpetual twilight, a soft, dim, eerie light like the world, just before sunrise or after sunset. And in that world, all the inhabitants, all the people, were green, just as she and her brother had been. One day, she explains, they were out in the fields, herding their father's flocks. Life was normal, quiet, twilight. Then they heard a sound. A loud, beautiful, captivating sound, like a great ringing of bells. Drawn by the sound, they left their flock and entered a cave. They walked towards the sound, following it through a long, dark passage. They wandered for a long time, lost in the subterranean blackness. Eventually, they saw a light ahead of them. They walked towards it and emerged from the mouth of the cavern, blinking and stunned, into a world of overwhelming, painful brightness. The light of your sun was a terrifying shock to their twilight-adjusted eyes. The heat was immense. They were disoriented and frightened by the intensity of it all. It was then, as they lay stunned and crying at the mouth of the cave, or, as you know it, the bottom of the wolf pit, that they heard the shouts of the reapers and were discovered. She said she had no idea how to get back. The entrance was gone. So to recap her story, green people, Twilight Land, followed a loud noise through a cave, ended up in Suffolk. Seems plausible, Dot. So, what on earth is going on here? This is a legend that has stubbornly resisted easy explanation for centuries. But there are theories. The most widely accepted and most mundane explanation is a historical one, and it serves as our mainstream fact for the evening. The children were likely the lost and traumatized orphans of Flemish immigrants. The history of 12th century England is key here. There had been waves of immigration from Flanders' modern-day Belgium into England. These Flemish weavers and merchants had established communities, particularly in the east of England. They were often encouraged by kings who wanted their skills. However, they were also outsiders, speaking a different language, a precursor to modern Dutch, and were often met with hostility by the local English population. During the chaos of the anarchy, these Flemish communities were violently persecuted. In 1173, not long after the children were said to have appeared, a major battle was fought at Fornham St. Martin, very near Woolpit, where a large number of Flemish mercenaries were slaughtered. The theory goes like this. The green children were from a nearby, isolated Flemish settlement. Perhaps their village was attacked and their parents were killed. They fled into the vast and unfamiliar Thetford Forest. Lost, terrified, and speaking only Flemish, they would have seemed utterly alien to the English-speaking villagers of Woolpit. Their strange clothes were simply Flemish fashion. And their green skin? This could have been a symptom of a real medical condition. Chlorosis, also known as green sickness, is a severe form of hypochromic anemia caused by extreme malnutrition. It disrupts the production of red blood cells, and in some rare cases, can give the skin a noticeable greenish tint. The children, starving in the forest, could well have developed this condition. Their obsession with beans also makes a sad kind of sense. In a state of near starvation, having been without food for days or weeks, the sudden sight of a familiar food source beans were a staple of the Flemish diet would have been overwhelming. Their bodies and their minds would have fixated on it as their only source of salvation. Ganymede's strange story of St. Martin's Land could be a child's confused, trauma-induced memory, a garbled fairy tale she constructed to make sense of an incomprehensible event. St. Martin's Land could be a distorted memory of her home, village of Fornham St. Martin. The Twilight Land could be the dark, dense canopy of Thetford Forest, where she and her brother were lost. And the loud ringing of bells could have been the church bells of nearby Bury St. Edmunds, which they followed, leading them out of the forest and into the fields of Woolpit. This theory neatly explains most of the strange details of the story in a logical, if tragic, way. But the story's inherent weirdness has, of course, led to more imaginative explanations. This is our quirky tidbit, the sheer range of fringe theories the Green Children have inspired. Over the centuries, people have suggested they were aliens, accidentally teleported to Earth, or that they were inhabitants of a hollow Earth who wandered out through a portal. Or perhaps they were from a parallel dimension that briefly intersected with our own. These theories are not history, of course, but they are a testament to the story's enduring power to ignite the imagination. It's a story that feels like it should have a magical explanation. And this leads us to the core scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the story of the Green Children of Woolpit is a garbled account of a real, though tragic, historical event, or if it is essentially a piece of pure folklore, a local fairy tale that was recorded by the chroniclers as fact. If it's folklore, it's a story about the boundaries between worlds, the safe, known world of the village versus the wild, magical otherworld of the forest, often seen as the realm of fairies. The children emerging from a pit at the edge. Of the village would be classic liminal figures, beings from that other world who trespass into our own. The story functions as a powerful local myth, a way of exploring the unknown. The fact that the two chroniclers, living in different parts of England, both recorded the story with such similar details gives it a strong claim to being based on a real event. But the details themselves are so dreamlike that it's impossible to be certain. What became of Agnes, the girl who survived? The chronicler Ralph of Coggeshall adds a final, grounding detail to his account. He says that she was rather loose and wanton in her conduct, and that she eventually married a man from King's Lynn, a town some 40 miles away, and was still living when he was writing his history. This mundane, slightly judgmental, and very human ending is perhaps the strangest part of the story. A being who may have come from another world, who appeared in a field with green skin, ends up not returning to her Twilight Land, but simply getting married and settling down into a normal medieval life. It's a beautifully anticlimactic end to a profoundly mysterious tale. The girl from the stars, or from the center of the earth, becomes a housewife in Norfolk Dock as you settle back. Let the image of that English harvest field fade. The story of the Green Children leaves us in a different place than our other legends. The Shield Maiden was a myth made real by science. The Assassin's Paradise was a lie that obscured a more complex reality. The werewolves were a folk memory, filtered through propaganda. But the green children are a puzzle. They exist in a strange space between history and folklore, a recorded event that feels like a fairy tale. It's a quiet, gentle mystery that reminds us that sometimes the most baffling legends are not about great warriors or mythical kings, but about two lost, scared children who appeared one day, as if from nowhere. The quiet mystery of the green children lingers, a puzzle box with no key. We are left at the edge of a field in Suffolk, staring into a hole in the ground that might be a gateway to another world, or simply the hiding place of two lost and terrified orphans. And it is this idea of the edge, the boundary between the known and the unknown, that will guide our final journey tonight. We are moving from the edge of a single field to the edge of the entire world, as it was known to medieval Europeans. We are setting sail from the solid, predictable land and venturing out onto the last and greatest of the blank spaces on the map, the ocean. A place where every fear, every superstition, and every wild imagining of the medieval mind could be given a monstrous form. We are sailing into the sea of darkness. Let your mind drift now, out from the heart of England, towards the coast. You can smell the salt in the air, a sharp, clean scent that cuts through the familiar smell of the land. You are standing on a cliff, looking west, out over the vast, gray, churning expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. To the medieval mind, this was not just a large body of water. This was the Mare Tenebrosum, the sea of darkness, the outer ocean. It was the absolute limit of the known world. Everything you knew, your village, your kingdom, your entire continent was behind you. Ahead of you was an infinity of water that, for all you knew, might stretch on forever, or might pour over the edge of the world into a black abyss. While the idea that most educated medieval people believed in a flat earth is largely a myth, the psychological effect of this enormous, uncharted ocean was very real. It was a place of profound terror. Sailors told stories. Tales whispered in smoky taverns in port towns. Stories of what lay out there beyond the horizon. They said that far to the south, the sun was so hot that it boiled the sea and would turn a white man's skin permanently black. They spoke of magnetic mountains on the seafloor that would pull the iron nails right out of a ship's hull, causing it to fall apart in an instant. They warned of a thick, soupy, congealed sea where a ship could get stuck forever, and of winds that would either abandon you to a dead calm or tear your sails to ribbons. This was a place where the rules of God and nature no longer applied. It was a realm of chaos, and in that chaos there were monsters. You have probably seen them on reproductions of old maps. The coiled sea serpents, the tentacled beasts, the dragon-like creatures that lurk in the margins of the ocean. The phrase we often associate with this is Hic sunt dracones, here be dragons. It's a wonderfully evocative line, but it's a bit of a historical quirk. The phrase itself only appears on one known antique globe, a small copper Lenox globe from the early 1500s. But the spirit of the phrase, the practice of filling the terrifying voids of the map with monsters, was absolutely real. This is a key mainstream historical fact. These monstrous illustrations were a cartographic tradition, a way for mapmakers to signal danger, to mark a territory as unexplored, and perhaps to cover up their own lack of knowledge. It's the most impressive way of saying, I don't know, that humanity has ever devised. Just draw a giant, scaly squid thing and call it a day. Let's sail into that illustrated ocean. You are on the deck of a medieval ship, a tiny, tubby, wooden vessel called a cog. It creaks and groans around you, a constant symphony of stressed wood and rope. The waves, which looked so small from the shore, are now mountains of gray water that lift you up to the sky and then drop you sickeningly into a trough. You have been out of sight of land for weeks. The food is a grim affair of hardtack biscuits, so full of weevils that old sailors joked the bugs were the only source of fresh meat on a long voyage. And as you stare out at the endless, mesmerizing, terrifying sea, your mind, already primed by fear and exhaustion, is ready to see monsters in every shadow, in every strange shape that rises from the waves. And what monsters you see. Suddenly, off the port bow, something immense breaks the surface. It is a serpent, as thick around as an ancient oak tree, its head held high above the waves, its long, undulating body stretching back farther than you can see. It fixes your ship with a malevolent, unblinking eye before diving back into the depths, creating a whirlpool that threatens to capsize your vessel. Later, in a dead calm, you spot what looks like a small, grassy island in the distance. A welcome sight. But as you sail closer, the island begins to move. It is not an island at all, but the back of a colossal whale, or perhaps a turtle, so ancient that trees have grown upon its shell. This is the Jaskanias, from the famous legend of the Irish Saint Brendan, who supposedly held Easter Mass on the back of the beast before it woke up and swam away. It would definitely ruin your picnic when your lunch spot decides to go for a dive dot. And then there is the greatest terror of them all, the Kraken. The lookout screams, pointing to a disturbance in the water. The sea itself seems to be rising. A great fleshy mass, 1.5 miles around, emerges from the depths. It is not a single creature, but a living island of tentacles and suckers. Its arms, as thick as your ship's mast, rise from the water and wrap around your vessel. The wood splinters, the mast cracks. The ship is pulled under, dragged down into the black, crushing deep by a monster from the nightmares of the sea itself. These are the legends. But as with our other stories, they are not just pure fantasy. They are the result of real, observable phenomena being filtered through the lens of fear and folklore. The medieval sailor was not stupid. He was trying to make sense of a world for which he had no scientific explanation, and the ocean is full of genuinely strange and terrifying things. The legend of the Kraken, for instance, is almost certainly born from fleeting, terrifying encounters with a very real creature, the giant squid, an animal of the deep, rarely seen by humans, that can grow up to 40 or 50 feet long, with eyes the size of dinner plates and powerful tentacles lined with suckers. Imagine you are a medieval fisherman in a small boat, and one of these true behemoths rises from the depths, its pale flesh and enormous eye appearing for just a moment before it vanishes. What other word would you have for it but monster? The story you tell back on shore would grow with each telling, until the giant squid becomes the island-sized kraken. And the sea serpents? They too have their real-world counterparts. The ocean is home to the oarfish, a bizarre deep-sea fish that can grow up to 36 feet long. It's flat and ribbon-like, with a red, crest-like dorsal fin. They are rarely seen, but when a storm washes one ashore, it looks for all the world like a monster. And at sea, a pod of dolphins or whales, swimming in a single-file line and cresting the waves one after another, could easily create the illusion of one long, undulating serpentine body. Even a large mass of seaweed, caught in a current, could trick the eye. The mind sees what it is prepared to see dot, as for mermaids and sirens, those beautiful fish-tailed women who lured sailors to their doom. The most likely culprit is the much less glamorous manatee or dugong. These large, slow-moving marine mammals have paddle-like forelimbs and a vaguely humanoid face. To a lonely, exhausted, and probably malnourished sailor who has been at sea for 6 months, a fleeting glimpse of one of these creatures, cradling its young at the surface, could be easily mistaken for a woman. It's a classic case of wishful thinking meeting poor visibility. One has to imagine they'd be a bit disappointed up close. But were these all just honest mistakes? This brings us to a good-natured scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether sailors of monsters were purely genuine misinterpretations, or if they were, in part, deliberate exaggerations, tall tales told to impress the landlubbers back home. There might have also been a commercial motive. If you've discovered a rich new fishing ground or a profitable trade route, what better way to discourage your competitors than by populating the surrounding waters with stories of terrifying ship-sinking monsters? It's the ultimate form of trade secret protection, the artistic tradition of the monster. Map reached its zenith in the Carta Marina, a magnificent map of Scandinavia and the North Atlantic created by the Swedish churchman Olaus Magnus in 1539. While it's technically a product of the Renaissance, it is the ultimate expression of this medieval worldview, and it is filled with the most wonderfully bizarre creatures. Our quirky tidbit for this final leg of our journey. Olaus drew not just sea serpents and krakens, but also a sea swine, a pig-like monster with a scaled back and tusks, and even a sea bishop, a creature that looked like a bishop in his full ceremonial mitre, but with fins instead of legs. It shows a belief that the sea was a kind of mirror world to the land, containing monstrous aquatic versions of all the creatures they knew. But as we peel back the layers of legend, we must not forget the very real horrors that every medieval sailor faced. The true monsters of the Sea of Darkness were not krakens and serpents. The true monster was scurvy, the slow and agonizing disease, caused by a lack of vitamin C that made your teeth fall out and your body waste away. The true monster was thirst, when the fresh water ran out and you were surrounded by an ocean of undrinkable salt. The true monster was a sudden storm that could snap a mast like a twig and send your tiny ship and all its crew to the bottom. Minutes. And the greatest monster of all was the psychological terror of being lost. A tiny speck of wood and life in a vast, indifferent, and utterly empty wilderness of water. The fantastical sea creatures on the maps were, in a way, a comfort. They gave a face and a form to these formless fears. It is easier to be brave against a dragon, you can see, than against the slow, invisible creep of disease or the crushing, existential dread of the unknown. And what pushed them to face these monsters, both real and imagined? Often it was the pull of legends like the ones we've talked about. The search for the mythical kingdom of Prester John, as we saw, was a major driver for the Portuguese to brave the coasts of Africa. The desire to find a sea route to the riches of the Indies, to bypass the long and dangerous Silk Road, forced them to sail off the edge of their maps and into the realm of monsters. And in doing so, they defeated the legends. With every successful voyage, the Sea of Darkness became a little brighter. The monsters were pushed further and further into the margins, until the maps showed not dragons and krakens, but coastlines, currents, and safe harbors. The search for a fake world helped them to chart the real one. The legends were the dragons that guarded the treasure of knowledge, and they had to be confronted before the prize could be won. So tonight, we have journeyed from a Viking grave in Sweden to the mountain fortress of the assassins. We have searched for a phantom kingdom across the maps of the world, listened to a werewolf's confession in an Irish forest, and puzzled over the arrival of green-skinned children in a sleepy English village. And finally, we have sailed into the monstrous heart of the unknown sea. All of these legends, which seem so strange and fantastical to us now, were deeply real to the people of the time. They were their way of explaining the world, of grappling with its mysteries, its dangers, and its wonders. They show us a world where the boundaries between the real and the imaginary, between history and myth, were fluid and uncertain. A world that was, in many ways, much bigger than our own, because so much of it was still filled with the possibility of magic. And now, as our long journey through these half-forgotten worlds comes to its final, quiet close, let the rhythm of the story begin to soften, and let the rise and fall of the imaginary waves on that sea of darkness gently merge with the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing. The monstrous images on those ancient maps can fade from your mind's eye, their sharp teeth and coiled tails dissolving into the soft darkness of your room, for you are safe on the shores of the known world, far from those ancient terrors. Those legends, once so powerful, are now just stories, their mysteries solved or settled into the peaceful dust of history, their sharp edges worn smooth by the passage of time. They are curiosities for us to ponder as we drift towards sleep, comfortable in the knowledge that the maps are all filled in now, and that the world outside your window holds no Krakens, no curses, no phantom kings that feel the journey of this night. Gently receding, like a ship sailing away over the horizon, growing smaller and smaller until it is just a speck, and then nothing at all. All that remains is the calm, the quiet, and the gentle pull of slumber. You can let go of these stories now. Release them into the peaceful emptiness of the night. The only sea you need to navigate now is the deep and gentle ocean of your own dreams, a place of perfect quiet and effortless peace. A story is being set in stone and soil, a story of power, respect, and a life lived against the grain. A story that was then forgotten, its true meaning obscured by our own assumptions for 1,000 years. The discovery of the Birka Shield Maiden doesn't mean that there were armies of female Viking warriors. That's almost certainly not the case. The traditional gender roles were still the norm. But it proves that exceptions were not just possible, but that they could reach the highest echelons of society. It opens a crack in the monolith of the patriarchal past, allowing for a more nuanced and complicated picture to emerge. She wasn't just a woman with weapons. She was a warrior who was a woman, and her existence makes the world of the Vikings feel that much richer, that much more surprising, and that much more human. It reminds us that history is not a static, settled thing. It is a living conversation, constantly revised by new discoveries that force us to look back and see the past not as we imagined it, but as it might have truly been. As you stand on that hill today, the wind rustling the birch leaves, you can almost feel the weight of that story. The quiet mound becomes something more. It's a monument to a woman who defied the expectations of her time and ours. A commander who played a game of strategy in life and took the board with her into death. The legend was that women could be warriors. The reality, sealed in this grave, is that at least one of them was, and she was not just a warrior, but a chief. It's a powerful thought to drift off on. The idea that the stories we dismiss as fantasy might just be truths we haven't found the evidence for yet. That buried beneath our feet, all over the world, are the remains of people who lived lives far grander and stranger than we can possibly imagine. The Shield Maiden of Birka was a myth we thought was fake. Now, she is history. And as you settle in, letting the story fade into the background of your mind, you can perhaps picture her, not in a bloody battle, but in a quiet moment at the end of a long day, sitting by the fire in a smoky longhouse, moving a carved piece across a game board, planning her next move. A silent tactician, her story finally told. The silence here on Birch Island is profound. The sounds of the modern world, the hum of traffic, the distant sirens are all gone. There is only the wind, the cry of a lone gull, and the gentle lapping of the lake water against the shore. It is a silence that holds 1,000 years of history. In that quiet, you can better appreciate the magnitude of what lies beneath the grass. It's not just a collection of artifacts. It's the final chapter of a human life, a life that was lived with a purpose and a power that we are only just beginning to understand. It's a sobering reminder that our understanding of the past is a constantly shifting landscape, and a single, carefully analyzed piece of bone can reshape it entirely. We love to put people from the past into neat little boxes, The men were like this, the women were like that. It simplifies things, makes history easier to digest. But people are never that simple. The Burqa commander is proof of that. She doesn't fit in the box. She breaks it dot. It's almost a little funny, isn't it? The image of those 19th century archaeologists, so certain in their worldview, carefully documenting the grave of a great male chieftain. They saw exactly what they expected to see. Their own cultural biases acted as a filter, preventing them from even considering an alternative. They weren't bad scientists. They were simply products of their time, just as we are, products of ours. It makes you wonder what we are currently looking at, in museums or in the ground, that we are completely misinterpreting because of our own modern assumptions. What other legends are lying in wait, dismissed as fantasy, that are actually just waiting for the right technology or the right shift in perspective to be revealed as truth. Let's think about her horses, a Mare and a stallion, a matched pair. This wasn't just about providing a mount for the afterlife. It was about projecting an image of immense status. Horses were expensive to buy, expensive to keep, and essential for rapid movement on land. For a military leader, they represented speed, command, and control of the landscape. The fact that she had two, and that they were sacrificed for her, speaks volumes about her importance to the community of Burqa. They were giving up a significant asset. It was a testament to her value. You don't make that kind of sacrifice for someone who is merely a figurehead. You do it for someone whose leadership was real and deeply felt. You could almost hear the whinny of the horses, their hooves stamping nervously on the packed earth, their warm breath misting in the cold Scandinavian air on the day of the funeral. A sad, solemn, but necessary part of sending their commander on her final journey dot. And so, the story of Grave BJ 581 is not just the story of one woman. It is the story of how we study the past, and how the past can reach out and change the present. It's a lesson in humility, a reminder to question our assumptions and to be open to the possibility that the truth is far more complex and surprising than the simple stories we tell ourselves. The Shield Maiden is not a comic book character. She is not a fantastical warrior princess. She is a 10th century woman, a human being of bone and blood who held a position of power in a complex society, and who was buried with the full honors befitting her rank. Her story, once a legend, is now a part of our shared human history. And as the evening deepens around you, and the world outside your window grows quiet, let that thought settle. The past is not a dead and buried thing. It is a place of sleeping giants and hidden truths, waiting for us to listen. That quiet hum of history, sleeping just beneath the surface, is not confined to the cold north. Let's leave the damp chill of Burqa behind. Let your mind drift, pulling away from the gray lake and the green birch trees, traveling south and east. You're moving across continents, over the dark, sprawling forests of Europe,